The town of Windermere sat quietly by the sea, tucked between restless waves and the sigh of pine-covered cliffs. Tourists sometimes passed through in the summer, but autumn had already painted the skies in shades of amber, and the streets had emptied. For most people, Windermere was a dot on the map, forgettable, sleepy, too quiet. But for Evelyn Hart, it was home, and she had long ago decided it was enough. Her bookshop sat on the corner of Rose Street, its windows fogged from the morning chill. A bell chimed whenever a customer entered, though these days, the bell barely stirred. Evelyn didn't mind. She preferred the silence of stacked novels, the smell of aged paper, the company of words that didn't demand much from her. She lived above the shop in a small apartment, and her days blurred into one another in a rhythm she found oddly comforting. That morning, she moved through the narrow aisles with a duster in hand, her brown hair tied back loosely, her cardigan slipping off one shoulder. The air carried the scent of rain, though the storm hadn't yet arrived. She paused by the poetry section, running her fingers along spines, as though reassuring herself that the words were still there, waiting to be read. The bell rang. Evelyn blinked, surprised. Few strangers wandered in at this hour. The man who entered shook rain off his jacket, though the drizzle outside was light. He had a camera slung around his neck and a look of curious wonder that seemed out of place in the sleepy shop. His dark hair was slightly messy, his eyes a shade of gray that reminded Evelyn of storms at sea. He paused by the entrance, scanning the shelves as if he had stumbled upon a hidden treasure. "Morning," he said, voice warm but carrying the trace of a traveler's weariness. Evelyn nodded politely. "Good morning. Let me know if you're looking for something particular." He smiled, though his eyes lingered on her longer than on the shelves. "Actually, I was just wandering. I didn't expect to find a bookshop here." "Most people don't," Evelyn replied, turning back to her dusting. "Windermere isn't exactly famous for its bookstores." "That makes it better," he said, stepping further in. The floorboards creaked under his boots. "The best places are the ones you don't plan to find." The storm lingered over Windermere for 2 days, sending waves crashing against the cliffs and leaving the streets deserted. Evelyn spent most of that time in the shop, pretending to reorganize shelves, though the rows hardly needed it. Her thoughts kept circling back to the stranger Adrian Cole, she told herself. She had no reason to think of him. Strangers passed through Windermere all the time, but rarely did they stay in her mind like words underlined in a book. On the third morning, when the skies finally cleared, the bell above the shop door chimed again. Evelyn's heart stuttered. Adrian stepped inside, camera in hand, hair damp from the sea breeze. He grinned as though they were old friends. "You're still here," he said lightly. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "This is my shop. Where else would I be?" "Fair point," he said, wandering toward the counter. "I wasn't sure if you'd remember me." "I remember most customers," she replied, though her voice softened despite herself. He tapped the camera strap. "I've been trying to photograph the coastline, but the storm made a mess of it. Figured I'd wait it out here a bit longer." Evelyn tilted her head. "Windermere isn't exactly exciting." "Excitement isn't everything," Adrian said. "Sometimes quiet places tell the best stories." The remark caught her off guard. For a moment, Evelyn wondered if he somehow saw through her the carefully constructed calm. The life she had chosen because it hurt less than reaching for something she might lose again. Adrian didn't press. Instead, he wandered toward the fiction shelves, pulling books down at random. He asked her about them, whether she had read them, which she liked best. His questions weren't the shallow kind that tourists ask to fill silence. He listened, genuinely interested. Before long, Evelyn found herself leaning against the counter, answering more than she intended. She spoke about authors she admired, stories that had kept her company on long nights, lines of poetry that felt like whispers from an old friend. "You sound like you live inside these pages," Adrian said quietly, after she quoted a line of Rilke without realizing it. "Maybe I do," she admitted, lowering her eyes. "That doesn't sound like a bad place to live." The words lingered between them. By the time he bought another book this time, a slim volume of poetry, the afternoon had passed. He left with the same easy smile, promising he might return. Over the following week, he did. Sometimes Adrian came in just to browse. Sometimes he bought a book, though Evelyn suspected he didn't have time to read them all. Other times, he lingered by the counter, asking questions about the town. Where was the best place to see the sunset? Did she know the history of the lighthouse on the cliffs? What was Windermere like when she was a child? At first, Evelyn answered cautiously, but slowly, she found herself enjoying his presence. His curiosity wasn't intrusive. It was warm, as though he believed the world was worth discovering piece by piece. One afternoon, He set his camera on the counter and asked, "Do you ever think about leaving?" Evelyn froze. The question cut too close to the truth she rarely spoke aloud. "I did once," she said carefully, "but life has a way of keeping you where it wants you." Adrian studied her, but didn't push. Instead, he leaned back against the counter. "I've been running the opposite way, always leaving, never staying. Sometimes I wonder if I'm missing something important." Evelyn looked at him, really looked. He seemed confident, free, untethered, but in his eyes, she saw a flicker of weariness, perhaps even loneliness. "You can't live everywhere," she said gently. "At some point, you have to choose where your story belongs. And you chose here?" Evelyn hesitated. "Or maybe it chose me." Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat the silence between them was not heavy, but full. One evening near closing, Adrian arrived just as Evelyn was turning the sign to closed. "Sorry," he said, catching the door. "I didn't mean to interrupt." She hesitated, then stepped aside. "Come in, just for a minute." He walked in with a sheepish grin. "I wanted to give you something." From his bag, he pulled out a small photograph. It was the shop, captured from across the street at dusk, the windows glowing with amber light. The image seemed to breathe with warmth, like something out of a memory rather than a simple picture. Evelyn stared at it, her throat tightening. "You made this place look beautiful," she whispered. "It already is," Adrian said simply. "You just don't see it anymore." She set the photo down gently, afraid of bending it. "Why give this to me?" "Because some places deserve to be remembered," he replied. For a moment, Evelyn didn't know what to say, so instead, she murmured, "Thank you." Adrian nodded, his smile softer this time. "You don't have to thank me. I should thank you for giving me a reason to stay in one place longer than usual." Her heart skipped. She wanted to ask what he meant, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she busied herself with stacking a few stray books. He lingered for a moment longer, then said, "Good night, Evelyn Hart." "Good night, Adrian Cole," she replied, the words softer than she intended. When the door closed, Evelyn stood alone with the photograph. For the first time in years, she wondered what it might feel like to let someone step past the quiet walls she had built around herself. Windmere's autumn skies were never predictable. One day they stretched wide and blue, the next they brooded with heavy clouds rolling in from the sea. Evelyn had lived here her whole life and could read the weather the way others read a familiar book. That evening, she knew a storm was coming, not just from the horizon darkening, but from the strange heaviness in the air. And yet, the storm she feared wasn't entirely the one outside. Adrian had spent more days in Windmere than she had expected. Nearly 3 weeks had passed since their first meeting, and his presence had woven itself into the rhythm of her days. He would appear with his camera slung around his neck, ask her questions about novels, or tell her stories of the places he'd seen: sunsets in Morocco, train rides across Europe, misty mornings in the Scottish Highlands. Evelyn listened with a mixture of awe and caution. His life sounded vast. Hers was contained within the walls of her shop. The gap between them frightened her. One late afternoon, when the clouds were bruised with violet, Adrian walked into the shop with an energy that felt different. He leaned against the counter, his smile just a little too bright. "I've been offered something," he said, without preamble. Evelyn looked up from the ledger she was balancing. "Offered what?" "A gallery in New York wants to showcase my photographs. It would mean traveling again, maybe for months." Her hand stilled on the page. She forced her voice to stay even. "That sounds wonderful." "It should," he said, but his smile faltered. "So why do I feel like I'm hesitating?" Evelyn shut the ledger. She could feel the storm gathering, both in the skies outside and inside her chest. "Maybe because you've stayed here longer than usual." He studied her, his gray eyes intent. "Maybe because I've found something here I don't want to walk away from." The words lodged in her chest like a stone. She wanted to believe them, but another part of her, the part that still remembered the sting of abandonment, recoiled. "You don't belong here, Adrian," she said quietly. "You're meant for the world, not for this." "Is that what you think?" His voice sharpened, not in anger, but in disbelief. "Or is that what you've convinced yourself because it's safer?" Evelyn's breath caught. She turned away, pretending to straighten the books on the shelf, though her hands trembled. "Don't," she whispered. "Don't pretend you know me." "I'm trying to," he said softly, "but you won't let me."
That night, the storm broke. Rain pelted against the shop windows, and the wind howled through the narrow streets. Evelyn sat upstairs in her apartment, staring at the photograph. Adrian had given her the glowing image of her shop at dusk. She remembered the warmth in his voice when he said, Some places deserved to be remembered. But what about people? Did he mean her too? For heart warred with her mind. Part of her longed to believe him, to trust that he meant the words, that he saw something worth staying for. But memories rose unbidden of Daniel, her former fiancé who had once promised forever before, leaving for a job in another city and never coming back. The wound had scarred, but it had not healed. Adrian's wandering eyes, his restless spirit, it was too close, too dangerous. She couldn't risk being left behind again. The next morning, the storm's fury had passed, but the streets were littered with broken branches and scattered leaves. Adrian arrived at the shop as though the weather hadn't touched him at all, though Evelyn saw the tension in his shoulders. He leaned on the counter, searching her face. "About yesterday." "Don't," she interrupted, her voice sharper than intended. "You don't have to explain. You should go. Take the gallery offer." His expression shifted, hurt flickering behind his eyes. "Is that what you really want me to do?" Evelyn forced herself to meet his gaze. "Yes." Silence stretched between them. The only sound was the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Finally, Adrian nodded. His smile was thin, almost bitter. "All right, Evelyn Hart. If that's what you want." He turned and walked out, the bell above the door chiming with finality. Evelyn stood frozen behind the counter, her chest tight, her throat burning. She told herself she had done the right thing, cut the thread before it could tangle into something painful. But when the door closed behind him, the shop felt emptier than it ever had before, and somewhere deep inside, she realized she had not told the truth.
The days after Adrian's departure stretched long and silent. Evelyn returned to her routine, unlocking the shop at 9, brewing tea in the back room, dusting shelves that didn't need dusting. Outwardly, nothing had changed, but inwardly, everything felt altered. The photograph of her shop sat on her desk upstairs. She had tried once to tuck it into a drawer, but the image refused to be hidden. Its quiet glow seemed to remind her of what she had lost, or worse, what she had pushed away. Customers noticed little. Windmere residents were used to Evelyn's reserved demeanor, but Mrs. Calloway, who came in weekly for mystery novels, remarked one morning, "You look pale, dear. Not sleeping?" Evelyn smiled thinly. "Just the weather." But it wasn't the weather. It was the echo of Adrian's voice, the storm gray of his eyes when she told him to go, the hollow ache that followed him out the door. 2 weeks later, news traveled through Windmere faster than the tide. Adrian Cole's photographs had been accepted by the gallery in New York. His name appeared in a small article in the regional paper, "Local visitor to showcase work abroad." Evelyn read the headline twice before setting the paper aside. Her hands shook, though she told herself it was from the draft seeping through the window. She had wanted this, hadn't she? For him to leave, to chase the dreams that belonged to him, not to her. So why did it feel like betrayal? As if he had broken a promise he never even made. One evening, when the sky hung low with fog, Evelyn closed the shop early and walked to the cliffs overlooking the sea. The lighthouse beam swept the horizon in slow arcs. The air smelled of salt and damp earth. She pulled her cardigan tighter, staring at the waves smashing against the rocks below. Once, she had stood here with Daniel, her former fiancé. He had held her hand and spoken of moving to the city, of building a life larger than this town. Evelyn had smiled then, trusting in the shape of his dreams until he chased them without her. The memory pressed hard against her chest. Adrian was different, she told herself. He hadn't promised her forever. He hadn't even promised her tomorrow. But he had left a mark just the same, as if the tide had carved his name into her. She turned from the cliffs, tears stinging her eyes. The sea swallowed secrets easily enough, but she could not throw this one away. Meanwhile, Adrian packed. His rented room above the old inn was littered with prints of his. Photographed sunsets, coastlines, streets that hummed with forgotten stories. Yet the image he couldn't stop looking at wasn't one of those. It was the portrait he had taken without Evelyn knowing. She had been shelving books, sunlight slanting across her face. He had captured her mid-motion, her expression distant yet tender, as though she were listening to some secret voice. It was one of his best photographs, and he hadn't shown her, because to show her would mean admitting what he hadn't dared to say. She was the reason he had stayed in Windmere longer than anywhere else. But she had told him to go, and Adrian, who had built his life on movement, knew no other way than to obey. The day before his train, he returned to the shop. Evelyn's heart stuttered when the bell rang and she saw him, though she masked it behind a carefully even expression. "You're leaving tomorrow," she said, her voice betraying nothing. "I am." He set a hand on the counter, as though steadying himself. I didn't want to go without saying goodbye. Her fingers tightened on the book she was holding. She wanted to ask him to stay. The words trembled at the edge of her tongue, but the memory of Daniel's broken promises coiled around her, holding her back. Goodbye, then, she said softly. Adrian studied her for a long moment. His eyes were searching, almost pleading, but when she gave nothing away, his shoulders sank. Take care of yourself, Evelyn Hart, he murmured. You too, Adrian Cole. He left a small envelope on the counter before turning and walking out. The bell chimed, the door closed, and this time, Evelyn knew he wouldn't be coming back. Inside the envelope, she found a photograph. It was her caught in golden light, surrounded by shelves of books. She stared at it until her vision blurred, until the weight of unspoken words pressed so heavy she could barely breathe. The breaking point had come, and she had let him go. One evening, when the snow fell softly outside, she pulled the photograph of herself from the envelope he had left behind. She studied it long into the night. It was strange, seeing herself through someone else's eyes. She looked softer, almost luminous, as if she belonged not just to the books, but to the world beyond them. For the first time, Evelyn wondered if she had been wrong, if she had let fear steal something she might never find again. Adrian's emptiness only grew. The gallery season ended, and with it the whirlwind of applause. He traveled again: Paris, Lisbon, Istanbul, but each place felt muted. He captured sunsets, crowded markets, winding streets, but none of the photographs carried the warmth he had once found in Windermere. And always, in quiet hotel rooms, he reached for his notebook. He never meant to write to her, yet page after page filled with words he couldn't keep inside. Adrian's notebook. Evelyn, you told me once I belonged to the world. Maybe that's true, but the world feels smaller without you in it. Everywhere I go, I look for your quiet steadiness, your way of seeing life like a fragile story worth protecting. And everywhere I fail to find it, I left because you told me to. But I don't know if I can keep running, not if it means running away from you. Neither of them sent the words. Evelyn's letters stayed locked in the wooden box. Adrian's notebook stayed buried at the bottom of his bag. But both knew, with a certainty that grew heavier each day, that the distance between them was not measured in miles. It was measured in silence, and silence, if it stretched too long, could break more than storms ever could. By February, Windermere lay under a blanket of snow. The sea raged in dark, restless waves, but the town itself seemed frozen in stillness. Evelyn kept the stove burning in the shop, though fewer and fewer customers braved the icy streets. She had grown used to the quiet again, or at least, she told herself she had. The wooden box of unsent letters sat heavy on her desk upstairs, a silent witness to everything she couldn't say. Sometimes she opened it, reread the words, and closed it again with trembling hands. But the truth pressed closer with every passing day. She had let someone slip away who had been worth holding on to. Adrian knew it too. He was in Lisbon when the decision struck him, not like a gentle nudge, but like a sudden wave that refused to let him breathe. He had been photographing a harbor at dusk, golden light spilling over fishing boats, when the thought came sharp and clear: this isn't enough. None of it is enough without her. He lowered his camera. The picture blurred in his hands. The sea stretched wide before him, but all he could see was Windermere's coastline, the cliffs, the lighthouse, the little shop on Rose Street with its warm-lit windows. The next morning, he booked his ticket. Evelyn was bent over a stack of invoices when the bell above the shop door chimed. She didn't look up immediately, assuming it was Mrs. Calloway again, braving the snow for her mysteries. Winter loosened its grip on Windermere slowly. By March, the snow had melted into streams that ran down toward the sea, and the skies carried the first hints of spring. Adrian had stayed. Each morning, Evelyn half expected to wake and find him gone, a note left in his place. But every day, when she came downstairs to open the shop, he was there, sometimes making coffee in the tiny kitchen, sometimes already setting up his camera by the window to capture the morning light. He didn't push her with promises. He simply stayed, and the steadiness of that choice became its own language. The town noticed. Mrs. Calloway raised her brows when she spotted Adrian carrying boxes of books into the shop one afternoon. Well, looks like Windermere caught itself a traveler. Adrian grinned easily, but Evelyn flushed. Later, she asked him, "Don't you mind? People will say you've given up your life of adventure." He shook his head. "Adventure isn't about constant motion. It's about finding something worth holding on to, and I've found it." The words made her chest ache in a new, gentler way. One evening, when the skies were clear for the first time in weeks, Adrian suggested they walk to the cliffs. Evelyn hesitated, remembering the last time she had stood there alone, full of regret. But with his hand in hers, the path felt different. They reached the lighthouse just as night fell. Above them, stars bloomed across the sky, bright, countless, as if the heavens themselves had returned after a long silence. Evelyn tilted her head back, breath catching. It's been months since I've seen them like this. Adrian lifted his camera, then lowered it again. Some things don't need to be captured. Some things are meant to be lived. She glanced at him, her heart swelling. Is this why you came back? For the stars? He smiled softly. No, but I think they came back for us. For a long while, they stood in silence, the waves crashing below, the sky glittering above. Evelyn felt the old fear stirring, the fear of losing, of being left. But Adrian's hand was warm and steady in hers, and she realized that love wasn't about erasing fear. It was about choosing, despite it. She turned to him, her voice low but certain. I don't know what the future will bring, but I know I don't want to face it without you. Adrian's eyes shone in the starlight. Then you never will. When he kissed her, it wasn't the reckless promise of forever. It was something truer, something steadier, a vow made not with words but with presence, with the simple act of staying. Later, walking back toward the town, Evelyn looked over her shoulder at the glittering sky. When the stars return, she murmured, maybe it means hope does too. Adrian squeezed her hand gently. Then we've got all the hope we need. And for the first time in years, Evelyn believed it. Not because the world had changed, but because she had let someone in, and he had chosen to stay. The shop on Rose Street would always be her home, but now it was no longer a place of silence. It was where their story began. Spring warmed into summer, and Windermere bloomed with color. The tourist season brought new faces into the shop, but Evelyn no longer dreaded the bell above the door. With Adrian often there, the shop had become more than a quiet refuge. It was alive again. Adrian hung some of his photographs along one wall, scenes of Windermere's cliffs, the lighthouse at dusk, the stars mirrored on the sea. Visitors admired them, sometimes even bought prints. Evelyn teased him that he had turned her little shop into half a gallery, but secretly, she loved it. One afternoon, when the light slanted gold through the windows, Adrian set down his camera and said, You know, I've taken photos all over the world, but none of them feel as alive as the ones here. Evelyn smiled, adjusting a stack of novels. Maybe because here is where you finally stopped running. He stepped closer, brushing his fingers against hers. Or maybe because here is where I finally found you. Seasons shifted. Years began to stretch between them. There were challenges. Of course, times when Adrian's restlessness stirred. Times when Evelyn's fears tried to rise again. But each time, they chose one another. Each time, they returned to the steady rhythm of the shop, the cliffs, the stars above. Windermere never became more than a small town by the sea. But to Evelyn and Adrian, it became something greater, a world they could both belong to. One clear autumn night, standing again on the cliffs where their story had broken and mended, Evelyn looked up at the sky. The stars shimmered, countless and bright, just as they had that first night of return. She leaned her head against Adrian's shoulder and whispered, Do you think they'll always come back? Adrian pressed a kiss to her hair. The stars always, and so will we. Evelyn closed her eyes, letting the truth of it settle deep within her. When the stars returned, so did hope, and for the rest of their days, they carried that hope together.